Throughout its long history, the Imperium has conquered numerous worlds. However, it might never have existed if the Emperor had not initiated the Unification Wars. Over the course of 162 years, the Lord of Humanity conquered Terra, subjugating states such as Ursh, the Ethnarchy of the Caucasian Wastes, Albia and many others, thus giving humanity hope for the future. By the end of the 29th millennium, nearly 300 centuries had passed since humanity first left an overpolluted and exhausted Earth, to journey to the unknown bounties and dangers of the stars beyond their homeworld. It is unknown what enemies and trials mankind faced in those forgotten days of the dark age of technology, but as a result, colonies of Earthlings spread throughout the galaxy, with humanity scattered across millions of worlds, obtaining innumerable treasures and encountering unspeakable horrors. In those forgotten times, humanity was akin to gods, as science allowed people not only to reshape planets in the image and likeness of old Earth, but also to create servants from clay and iron, granting them life to carry out their commands. Thus, the human race entered the dark age of technology, and for millennia, humans dominated the galaxy until all their achievements were destroyed in an instant, in a vortex of brutality and ignorance, resulting in the deaths of countless billions, their cries unanswered and unheard. A new era dawned, subsequently known as the Age of Strife or the Long Night. The solar system and old Earth, as well as nearby star systems colonized by humanity during the dark age of technology, were cut off from interstellar travel and had no connection with each other. This was caused by powerful warp storms that swept across the galaxy, shaking the immaterium with the birth of the chaos god Slanesh. During this dark time, Terra occasionally obtained control over the solar system, but it failed to become the sole ruler, and at various moments in history, the system was dominated by the rulers of Mars or Luna. Similar situations were prevalent throughout the rest of the galaxy, as various inhabited worlds were perpetually at war with themselves or with other planets. During this prolonged period of anarchy, fear, and violence, which lasted 5,000 standard years, the once unified planetary government of old Earth completely disintegrated and fragmented into dozens of warring regressive states and tribes, so-called techno-barbarian factions. From the mid-27th millennium, wars raged continuously on the surface of Terra for 2,500 years, and conditions in other colonies were no better. Human civilization was torn apart, with small clans and tiny empires struggling for control over ruined worlds. Meanwhile, others, completely cut off from any aid, suffered from the horrors of planetary-scale famine, madness, and worse still, the gradual influence of the war. At that time, the existence of the warp and the dangers of the entities that dwell within it were barely comprehensible to the human mind. In worlds with a high concentration of psychers, entities from beyond easily breached the barrier between the immaterium and reality, and it is impossible to estimate how many worlds were devastated or entirely consumed by their invasions. As human interstellar civilization fractured, hundreds of unknown alien species and ancient enemies of humanity seized the opportunity to exact revenge for its past conquests. Hundreds of human-settled systems were looted and devastated, their inhabitants killed, maimed, or enslaved. Those who survived the Xenos onslaught quickly reverted to barbarism, losing civilization, knowledge, and culture in the brutal struggle for survival. Humanity, standing on the brink of total annihilation and endless night, awaited its end. The surviving human worlds, wrecked by internal strife, famine, plagues, ceaseless alien assaults, and the threat of warp demon invasions, became wretched shadows of what they once were during the age of technology. To the few who had time to ponder such matters, it seemed that there was no hope, no aid to be expected. They foresaw only a slow, bitter dissolution and destruction, believing that no force, however imaginable, could save humanity and free it from bondage. However, they were blind and deeply mistaken. In the Age of Strife, Terra descended into savagery and horror unprecedented in the galaxy. Little remained of the once sophisticated old Earth, which in its glorious past had been the center of a burgeoning interstellar civilization marked by advanced science, high culture, and unimaginable technology. The techno-barbarian warlords and their belligerent hordes ceaselessly fought over the planet, which had become nothing more than a battleground for a war of attrition. They used chemical, biological, and even thermonuclear weapons of mass destruction, gradually transforming the cradle of humanity into a battered post-apocalyptic wasteland, much of which was covered with radioactive scars. Long before the planet became a desert dotted with fortifications built on the ruins of fallen civilizations, and its inhabitants became a mass of degenerating wild nomads, mad prophets, cybernetic augmented butcher kings and religious demagogues led the warring tribes of old Earth, and the world was engulfed in endless conflict, as one tyrant replaced another. Petty empires rose and fell overnight, and tribes formed, were destroyed and reformed as diminished, hardened shadows of lost glory and forgotten triumphs. Countless billions of people died unrecognized and forgotten, and those who survived whispered names like the Unspeakable King and the Seven Neverborn, creating legends that would terrify future generations. Anarchy and bloodshed stood at the forefront of the dying civilization. It was against this backdrop of endless violence and unrestrained brutality that the Emperor of Mankind first revealed himself to the people of Terra in the 29th millennium as a warlord more powerful than any other. In secret, he had planned this moment in history for millennia, ever since the age of strife shattered what remained of the ancient human federation, which once spanned the galaxy. With his vast army of genetically enhanced warriors, who formed the first division of the Imperial Army and served as prototypes for the subsequent creation of the Space Marines, the Emperor began the conquest of Terra with the intention of uniting all warring techno-barbarian nations and establishing a single planetary government. However, the true strength of the Emperor lay not in his might but in his rationality and foresight. His scientific knowledge and experience were as unparalleled as his martial prowess, although few suspected the true scale of his power and abilities. Yet his conquests were not born of blood or ambition, for his design was significantly different from those of others. Despite numerous speculations and falsehoods, the Emperor began his journey towards the unification of humanity not with bloodshed, but with an alliance for which he travelled to the Urals, to the smith forge of the Terravat clan. And although people consistently plundered the riches of the Urals and the surrounding areas, none could compare to the scale of the Terravat clan. It was said that the strength of the clan originated from the same source as the Mechanicum. Otherwise, how else to explain that the techno-theologians of Terravate not only survived the dark age of technology, but also carved temples into the bones of the Ural Mountains, where they hid from the wrath of the long night in complete isolation until their very existence became a legend retold in whispers. When the members of Clan Terravate finally emerged from their lair, they found their planet ravaged by wars between monstrous etharchs and tyrants. However, as soon as the news of the clan's rebirth spread across the planet, petitioners from all corners of Terra came, eager to obtain their ancient wonders, offering deals, agreements, and threats in equal measure. Only the Emperor was able to offer the clan more than he sought to receive. In exchange for their weapons, he shared lost arts and knowledge. His vast knowledge of long-forgotten technologies brought the clan under the banner of unity, and the members of Clan Terravate gladly sacrificed much of their treasures for the Emperor's cause. The time for negotiations was over, and the time for war had come. The last war old Earth was to witness before its reforging. Leading an army consisting of the Legio Custode, Legiones Cataegis, or the Thunder Warriors, and regiments of genetically enhanced soldiers, the Emperor set out to conquer Earth, starting with the so-called Moorland Sen Confederacy located in the territory known as Nordeich, which was once called Scandinavia. The Emperor chose Moorland Sen as the first target for two reasons. The first was that he once knew its ruler, the King Priest of Moorland Sen, and the second followed from the first, as on their first meeting the man who became a monster did not heed the advice of the Master of Mankind. Once the King Priest had been a holy man, a mendicant preacher who wandered the northern wastes, gathering unspoiled food and clean water and distributing them to the needy. He claimed that this was his calling and that God lived in his goodness. Of course, it was a calling answered by the entities of the Immaterium. They granted him the power to feed a besieged tribe and heal their ailments, and the clan grew. When wild winters devoured other tribes, his clan remained under the protection of his power. The king-priest kept them fed, secure, and invisible to the eyes of hunting enemies. Soon hundreds of people basked in the warmth of his mercy and gave thanks to the God he believed he served. However, new miracles demanded much more than simple kindness, and over time a fervent zealot was born out of the humble preacher, sacrificing thousands to the warp entities just so his tribe could thrive. His followers paid no heed to the occult rituals he conducted, and soon joined them, calling upon their gods to grant them the same power as their leader. The most frightening thing was that neither the king-priest nor his flock realized who they were truly worshipping. And when the emperor once again met the king, there was not a trace left of the humble preacher, and his flock had turned into a horde of fanatics, witches, and genetically created abominations. During the first and last battle, the emperor, accompanied by 30 custodians, the 4th Legion of Thunder Warriors, and 22 regiments of the Imperial Army, met the army of the Priest King. Even though the forces of the Master of Mankind were outnumbered by the Confederation's army and suffered heavy losses, including 7,000 Thunder Warriors, they managed to defeat the Moreland Sen horde. After the battle, the Priest King stood before the Emperor, cursing him and condemning his actions, after which he was personally executed by the Master of Mankind. The Emperor had won his first victory and continued his conquests, setting his new target, Albia. However, doubts arose in the mind of the Emperor's loyal servant, Constantine Valdor, after the conquest of Nordeich. But he did not doubt the Master of Mankind's plans or methods. Rather, he questioned the warriors created by the Legiones Cateigis. Valdor saw them consumed by rage and madness during the battle with the unholy hordes of the Priest King, and he began to doubt their future, suspecting that their fate was already sealed. Meanwhile, the Emperor's forces were already moving towards their new target. The conquest of Albion proved to be a much more challenging task than the destruction of the Moreland Sen Confederation, as this techno-barbaric state was known for its ancient warlike clans and was almost entirely composed of towering, soot-blackened city assaults. The Albia refused to bend the knee to the Emperor, meeting his Thunder Warriors with their proto-dreadnoughts and the armoured soldiers of the Ironside clan. In battle after battle, the Albans managed to hold back the Emperor's forces, but at the cost of tremendous losses, making this techno-barbaric state a serious test for the Emperor's forces during the Unification Wars. So serious that the Emperor, impressed by the determined and brutal resistance of the state's defenders, decided to cease hostilities and conquer Albia through diplomatic means. Recognizing the warlike nature and indomitable spirit of his opponent, the Emperor called for a ceasefire and sought a resolution through negotiation. The Master of Mankind stood unarmed before the lords of the Albion clans, dressed in white and crimson robes, and spoke to them of his vision of a united humanity. He offered the Albans glory among the stars and redemption. To the shock of many, the warlords of Albia, seeing that the Emperor was different from past tyrants, accepted his terms and soon became some of the most fervent proponents of unity. Once Albia was under his sovereignty, the Emperor saw in the Albans the suitable genes for recruits of the nascent Astartes legions, and when they were created, the Albans formed the core of the 8th, 10th and 14th legions. After the victory over Albia, the Emperor conquered several other techno-barbarian states, including the Frank, Merica and Gyptus. Raptor Imperialis soon also flew over most of northeastern Africa, which was ruled by the so-called Ruby dynasty. The Ruby dynasty, or Adidigi, ruling from the depths of their citadel, did not support the Emperor's aspiration to unite humanity, and suffered a crushing defeat in several battles. Members of the Ruby dynasty lost their status and were forced to become simple labourers. However, not all states desired conflict with the nascent Imperium. For instance, the Achaemenid Empire was one of the largest geopolitical entities that swore allegiance to the Master of Mankind, and thus suffered little during the Unification Wars, having avoided both atomic bombings and the invasion of the Thunder Warriors. Due to their relatively peaceful existence and early acceptance of imperial rule, the Achaemenians had few genetic defects or anomalies observed among humans at that time. Therefore, the inhabitants of the empire were also chosen as a source of recruits for the emerging legions of the Adeptus Astartes. The Achaemenians formed the backbone of the 15th Legion, and according to records, the very first captain of the Thousand Sons, Arsec Ahriman, hailed from the royal family of the Achaemenid Empire. However, diplomatic conquests ended there, and war reignited with new intensity. The emperor turned his gaze to new lands, which lay not far from the new domains, specifically Ursh, the ethnarchy of the Caucasian wastes, the Pan-Pacific Empire and High Brazil. However, the ethnarchy could not be conquered in the first attempt, as its key cities were located in the mountains and were protected by force shields. The first assault on the cities turned into a massacre, claiming the lives of nearly 10,000 Thunder Warriors and about 1 million soldiers of the Imperial Army. The ethnarchy stood firm but was isolated and left by the Emperor for later. Meanwhile, the legions of the Master of Mankind advanced towards the techno-barbarian state of Ursh. Ursh was the most powerful techno-barbarian empire of old Earth before the Unification Wars began, and turned out to be one of the strongest enemies the Emperor's forces faced in the early stages of the conquests. Despite being a mighty empire, Ursh was not as technologically advanced as some of the other techno-barbarian states. To rectify this situation, the Lord of Ursh began a war against the conclaves of Nord Africa to enslave their inhabitants and equip his warriors with excellent war machines. When the imperial forces set foot on Ursh's soil, it was under the rule of a despot and warlord named Callaghan. Callaghan was known for his brutal nature and commanded vast armies of techno-barbarians. Callaghan was also known for wearing ancient armor known as the Armor of Pearl, which by the time of the Horus Heresy was stored as a trophy in the atrium of the Gates of Eternity within the Emperor's palace. The notorious exploits of Callaghan were documented in the ancient manuscript, the Chronicles of Ursh, which would later be regarded by imperial scholars as a classic work of human literature, containing valuable information about the rise of this state before unification and the wars of Ursh against their neighbours. In the Chronicles of Ursh, the influence of primordial gods on Callaghan and Ursh is mentioned. Moreover, Callaghan's sorcerous powers, referred to in the Chronicles of Ursh, comprised the main military might of Ursh. Therefore, it is highly likely that the Chaos gods were the true rulers of Ursh, and Callaghan was merely one of their puppets they manipulated to carry out their will. In Callaghan's army, besides himself, there were numerous other psykers, but the main fighting force of Ursh consisted of ordinary humans, divided into various units. Among these techno-barbarians were the mercenary riders of Roma, siege units known as the Red Machines, and hordes of berserkers called the Tupolov Lancers. However, despite the huge army and the favour of the Dark Gods, Callaghan could not achieve victory over the army of the Emperor of Mankind, which ultimately led to the defeat of Ursh and the death of Callaghan. The Pan-Pacific Empire, like Ursh, was an extremely powerful state, but shortly before the start of the Unification Wars, it was weakened due to continuous wars with Albia. This techno-barbarian state consisted of the islands of the Pacific Ocean and the territories of East Asia, Australia, and the Japanese islands. Initially, the territories of this region were controlled by numerous techno-barbarian tribes that often conflicted with the Indonesic bloc. Eventually, all the tribes of the Pacific region were united by a certain warlord named Khazar, who began waging war against the threat posed by a Brotherhood of Singularitism. This was a sect that sought to create a general-purpose artificial intelligence capable of leading to a technological singularity, which they hoped would save humanity from all woes. Although subsequent Mechanicum scholars mostly believed that the tribe's war against the Brotherhood of Singularitism was driven merely by their superstitions, there is suspicion that the peoples of the Empire actually realized that the Brotherhood of Singularitism was beginning to merge its technologies with the forces of the Immaterium with the help of demons, which boded ill for them. Khazar's forces successfully stormed the fortresses of the Brotherhood of Singularitism and largely destroyed the cult, although one of its leaders, Moravec, escaped to Mars. At some point after the unification, possibly around the 27th millennium, the Pan-Pacific Empire was conquered by a warlord known as the Unspeakable King. According to legends, the Unspeakable King was one of the strongest blanks in the entire history of humanity, and led entire cults of blanks to destroy psychers. However, his reign was not eternal, and eventually he was overthrown by the clans of Albia, and the Pan-Pacific Empire fell under the control of the self-proclaimed tyrant Nathan Doom. Under Doom's dominion, the empire became one of the most powerful techno-barbarian states, but the ongoing strife with Albia gradually sapped the strength of the Pan-Pacific Empire. Even though Doom was an extremely cruel ruler, he understood perfectly well that humanity had lost a significant portion of its knowledge. Yet he wondered whether this ignorance was a curse or a blessing, considering the horrors lurking beyond the war. However, shortly after the tyrant's rise to power, the Empire faced the Emperor's forces, and in a series of battles, the Pan-Pacific army was shattered by the forces of the Thunder Warriors and numerous mercenaries. Doom was captured, but was soon executed at the insistence of Constantine Valdor, and most members of his court were imprisoned in Kangba Mawu. High Brazil, though not as powerful a state as Ursh or the Pan-Pacific Empire, resisted the emperor for a long time but ultimately fell as well. At the time, the state was ruled by the despot Dalmuth Kin, but after he was defeated by the imperial army, power transferred to Lord Ferom Sikhar, his direct descendant. Due to his blood relation, Sikhar did not receive a seat on the Council of Terra because he was deemed unreliable. Although High Brazil was under imperial control, it existed as a semi-autonomous republic within the fledgling Imperium until the administratum was created by Malcador. The Unification Wars were practically concluded, but unexpectedly, a rebellion erupted in the lands of Frank. In the city of Avilroy, unrest was still simmering, and eventually it exploded when a man named Havulek Dagros claimed that he had been unjustly tried and sentenced to death for the murder of the governor of Avilroy. Before Havulek could be executed, his allies attacked the squad of soldiers sent for him. During the skirmish, however, Imperial troops killed several civilians, including the son of a local arbiter, which sparked public outrage. This, coupled with Havulek's gift for fiery oratory, was enough for a hastily formed militia to storm the local Imperial Army headquarters, seize weapons, and deal with the soldiers stationed at the garrison. Subsequently, Havulek attracted the residents of nearby settlements to his cause, and within a few months, the militia grew to almost 40,000 men and women. Instead of preparing for the inevitable retribution, the rebels regularly held parades and celebrations, reveling in their triumph. Soon after, the Imperium sent forces from the east to quell the rebellion. Upon hearing this, Havulek led the militia to meet them, further increasing his ranks as they advanced. After a week's march, the rebels took defensive positions on the hills of Gaduare, holding the high ground between the ruins of the old castle and the impassable swamps, awaiting the enemy's approach. By this time, the militia's strength numbered around 50,000 men. To suppress the uprising, 5,000 Thunder Warriors arrived and immediately took positions opposite the militiamen, about a kilometre away, waiting for them to make the first move. Relying on their numbers, the untrained and undisciplined militiamen rushed down the hillside in a mass towards the armoured giants, firing their weapons and shouting battle cries. The Thunder Warriors stood their ground, waiting for the militiamen to come close, and then fired a volley from their bolters. The first 5 ranks of the rebels were instantly annihilated by the explosive rounds. In the first wave of casualties was also Havulek, who had the lower half of his body blown off, dying in agony shortly after. The rebels stopped, paralyzed by shock, then broke and fled towards the hills in a panic. Despite the enemy being crushed by the initial volley, the Thunder Warriors pursued them, cutting down all in their path with their chainswords. Those who attempted to surrender or begged for mercy were also systematically annihilated. In less than an hour, the once brave horde of 50,000 Avilroy militiamen, who considered themselves the spark of a rebellion that would ignite the world, and allow them to throw off the emperor's yoke, were completely destroyed. Only one militiaman, Uriah Alata, survived. It was also revealed that Havulek had indeed attacked and killed the governor, exposing him as a charlatan who simply exploited those around him, and ultimately led tens of thousands of people to their deaths. The end of this battle marked the successful completion of efforts to unify Europe, where only the Scandian raiders, as is known, still remained independent from imperial rule. However, over time, even they were vanquished. This massacre also marked one of the final battles of the Thunder Warriors, as the nature of the impending war differed from previous campaigns, and considering their fundamental flaws, they became as much a threat to stability and the ascension of humanity as its enemies. Therefore, they had to cease to exist, but remain in legend as the greatest heroes. To birth such a legend, the Thunder Warriors were sent to the realm of Urartu. Imperial historical chronicles recount that the last major battle of the Unification Wars, known as the Battle for Mount Ararat, took place in Urartu territory in the year 669 of the 30th millennium, on a mountain that had once been submerged and lay underwater. During this final battle, according to the chronicles, all remaining warriors of the Thunder Warriors were killed by the Emperor's enemies to the last man. The chronicles record that the renowned Thunder Warrior Arik Taranis, known as the Stormbringer, raised the standard with the Raptor Imperialis during the final declaration of unity, which established the Emperor's dominion over all Terra before succumbing to his wounds. In truth, all remaining Thunder Warriors were killed by the order of the Emperor in the Battle of Mount Ararat by his loyal servants, the Legio Custodes. The Thunder Warriors were no longer needed for the grand plan of the Master of Mankind, as they had become biologically and mentally unstable, and thus needed to be replaced by more stable warriors, the Astartes. However, despite the declaration of unity, there were still 43 years left until the end of the Unification Wars. Suddenly, although the heroic demise of the Thunder Warriors did not go unnoticed, a conspiracy began to brew in the higher echelons of the nascent Imperium. It was led by Grand Provost Marshal Uwoma Kandawire and the surviving Primarch of the Thunder Warriors, Ushatan. The conspirators intended to take Constantine Valdor into custody and put him on trial for the massacre at Mount Ararat, which had not been agreed upon with the Council of Terra. They did not aim to overthrow the Emperor, but wanted to hold Valdor accountable and perhaps thus limit the power of the Master of Mankind. To accomplish this, the conspirators gathered significant forces ranging from mercenaries and Imperial army units to the Thunder Warriors who survived the massacre. Since the Imperial Palace, where Valdor was located, was sparsely populated, and the Emperor himself was occupied with other projects, the conspirators hoped they could overthrow the regime within the complex and arrest Valdor. Initially, they achieved great success and easily defeated the small army detachments, but then Ushatan and Kandawire encountered a lone custodian, who turned out to be Constantine Valdor himself. Valdor called on them to surrender, and when the conspirators refused, the Captain General unleashed 10,000 Astartes. Despite having only recently completed their training, the Astartes, using their superior teamwork and discipline, easily annihilated the army units as well as the remaining Thunder Warriors. Amidst this carnage, Valdor and Ushatan engaged in a duel, which ultimately resulted in the Captain General killing the Primarch of the Thunder Warriors. In truth, this coup was doomed from the start, as the custodians were well informed about the plans of the conspirators. To everyone's surprise, Kandawire was pardoned and allowed to retire peacefully, although she had to leave the palace. With the Astartes reinforced, the Emperor's armies began the accelerated conquest of the remaining territories. One of the first to fall was the Saragorn enclave, which had previously been conquered by the Emperor. However, the leaders of the enclave secretly conducted genetic experiments which greatly displeased the Master of Mankind. The newborn 8th Legion was sent to pacify the territory. The enclave quickly fell and was destroyed, and its inhabitants were brutally killed to serve as a warning to those who might think of breaking the oaths given to the Emperor. Another defiant territory was Boeotia, which resisted unification for a significant period, despite its government recognizing the Emperor's dominion over the rest of Terra. To preserve its independence, The ruling dynasty of Boeotia employed every available diplomatic stratagem, doing everything possible to maintain their power. Showing immense patience and favour, the emperor allowed the ruling dynasties of Boeotia Yasselti to exist in a semi-autonomous state for over 150 standard years, hoping they would integrate into the imperial government of Terra as soon as possible and with the greatest dignity. But instead, the House of Yasselti stubbornly clung to its independence until the imperial army, along with the Astartes of the 15th Legion, was forced to invade the province with orders to suppress the rebellious state. Subsequently, the Astartes of the 1st Legion seized the kingdom of Akkad, ruled by a cruel high king who resisted the Imperium for a long time, controlling Central Asia. The High King of Akkad was aided by his genetically enhanced slave soldiers, known as Udug-Hul. Their strength and endurance made them a terror in the Upper Asian basin. However, they were defeated at the hands of the 1st and 4 other unnamed legions in the Battle of Samarkand. Despite the High King's forces numbering about 200,000 men, while the Astartes' forces numbered only 10,000, the Udug-Hul were completely annihilated, and the few survivors fled in terror as their leader was slain. However, not all opponents of the emperor, whose states fell under the heel of the Imperium's war machine, were executed or imprisoned. At least one of them was bestowed with great honor. Thus, King Gotha, who ruled the techno-barbarian kingdom of Occitania, fought the imperial forces valiantly. Despite Occitania being conquered at the cost of nearly an entire company of the 8th Legion, the king was pardoned, and the emperor granted him the title of Rogue Trader. The surviving warriors of the 9th Company swore eternal service to him. Meanwhile, the emperor's forces split. He himself went to conquer the anarchy of the Caucasus Wastes, while significant forces of the 17th Legion were sent to Antarctica to conquer the mountain city of the state of Orlok. The inhabitants of Orlok believed they were the chosen children of ancient Terra, and that only they could survive the anarchy that had broken others. This confidence stemmed from their faith in the protection of spirits of death and life, an ancient pantheon of gods worshipped by the people of Orlok. The emperor understood that soft words and diplomatic tricks would be of little use here, and so he sent his best iconoclasts, the imperial heralds. When they arrived in the city, they gave its inhabitants a choice: to bow their knees and accept the imperial truth, or be annihilated. However, the priest-kings of Orlok did not even listen to the message before giving their answer, as Orlok forces immediately opened fire on the transport carrying the imperial envoys, and when it crashed onto the icy plains, the 17th Legion commenced their assault. Bombardiers appeared in the sky instantly, and the mountain on which the city stood cracked open under a rain of seismic charges. Siege tanks advanced on the city from the flanks, firing shells into the fissures in the rock, penetrating it completely. Following them were warriors in grey armour, showering everything around them with bolter fire and scorching with flamethrowers. After 3 solar hours of battle, the remaining inhabitants were herded into the central cavern. When all other tunnels and caves had been cleared, the Astartes halted the attack, sealing all pathways, entrances and exits to the central cavern. Meanwhile, the survivors, in anxious silence, pondered what fate awaited them. The answer came in the form of a rain of stone shards and red fire. The elite iconoclasts of the imperial envoys, Astartes from the ruthless special formation known as the Ashen Circle, descended upon the last idolaters like comets cast down from shattered heavens. They killed everyone, sparing no one. And when it was all over, the Marines overloaded the geothermal power stations beneath the mountain, causing lava to fill the caverns, consuming the stone idols and the city itself. Thus fell Orlok, and the news of its destruction spread across Terra and beyond. Now everyone understood that faith in false gods would bring only destruction and ash. The conquest of the Caucasus Wastes became one of the last great battles of the Unification Wars, resulting in the Emperor becoming the uncontested master of Terra. But the victory did not come easily. The mutated eugenics oligarchs who ruled the Caucasus Wastes posed one of the most challenging threats that the Emperor's forces faced during this war. Although the Caucasus Ethnarchy was small in number compared to the fanatics of the Indonesic bloc or the wild hordes of Ursh, its power was based on dozens of relic technologies and terrible weapons that they had at their disposal since before the Age of Strife. Furthermore, the Ethnarchy's army was extremely diverse, ranging from armoured, genetically enhanced mercenaries of Ursh, approximately equivalent to the Thunder Warriors in strength, to drug-enslaved covens of psychers. This was enough to halt the Imperial forces' invasion initially. Therefore, when the time for retribution arrived, nothing could be left to chance. For the final assault on the Caucasus wastes, the combined forces of 6 legions of Astartes were gathered, along with the united forces of the Legio Custodes, led by the Emperor himself, and a multi-million-strong army consisting of various mechanized battalions. The first strike, upon which much depended, was entrusted by the Emperor to the 18th Legion, and although the decision to use an unknown and untested unit for such an important task was questioned by many members of the Imperial Command, the Emperor's will was carried out. All forces of the Legion, numbering around 20,000 Astartes, were directed to a mission that was considered suicidal by general consensus: the destruction of the enormous geothermal furnaces that powered the impregnable defences of the Ethnarchy. These furnaces were located far below the underground fortresses and were known only through ancient legends that described them as lying within a 100-kilometre sequence of enormous artificially created caverns, known as the Tempest Galleries, because of the incessant storms of flame and electromagnetic forces erupting from ancient and poorly understood relic mechanisms. The power armour of the legionnaires was specially modified for the extreme conditions they were to face, and was camouflaged with streaks of sulphur yellow and sable black colours. Once everything was ready, the warriors saluted their emperor and, calmly boarding the previously untested thermite machines, pierced through the dark earth and rocks at the edge of the wastelands, disappearing into a deadly and unknown world. Soon, any signals from them were lost, and even the power of the Imperial psychers could not penetrate the stormy depths to maintain contact with the Astartes assault forces. Hours turned into solar days, days into solar weeks, and nothing was heard from the assault squads while the Emperor's vast army waited in full readiness for a grandiose attack. But no signs or signals came. It is said that the Emperor silenced his worried commanders and said, "They will not fail me. They will return from the fire, and so it shall always be." According to some records, moments after the Emperor's words, the region was shaken by strong tremors, which were felt even in the city and the jade citadel of Hangul. Following this, the force fields that had long protected the Caucasian wastelands failed, and the full force of the Emperor's wrath fell upon the citadels of the Ethnarchy, completely destroying them. The last Ethnarch of Caucasus was dragged in chains to the imperial prison at Kangba Marwu, and his ancient secrets, which were the source of his power, were claimed by the new Lord of Terra. The final battle of the Unification Wars was the subjugation of the Indonesic bloc, which had long been under the rule of the Ethnarch Cardinal Tan. This man sought to return the world to a pre-technological age, burning scientists, mathematicians and philosophers who opposed the views of his church. Tan implemented a policy of genocide, which involved the forced reproduction of only genetically compatible citizens of the bloc, in conjunction with the Eugenica program, aimed at ensuring racial hygiene through forced sterilization and the genocide of the undesirable. Those who did not comply with these coercive edicts were brutally punished. Imperial history would later characterize Tan's rule as a series of bloody pogroms, death camps, and genocide. However, in the end, the Indonesic bloc was conquered by the Imperium, and Tan was captured and imprisoned in the notorious Kangba Marwu colony. The cardinal attempted to disguise his identity and hide among the common folk, but only a few days after his arrival, Tan's fellow inmates discovered his true identity and killed the former Ethnarch. The battles had ended, and the populace of Terra received not only stability and peace, but also hope for the future. Even during the Conquest, the the Emperor had already established civil administration to order and restructure Terra, aiming to transform it into a throne world from where the Emperor could govern the other human-occupied worlds, as it was understood that the conquest of Terra was just the beginning. Nevertheless, despite the absence of constant battles on the planet, the Unification Wars were not yet concluded, as the Emperor had one final adversary, Uriah Olather, a surviving rebel from Frank. Alat was born into a clan that had endured the destructive age of strife while preserving much of its wealth, owning substantial lands. This provided Olather with a privileged upbringing, but he developed a rebellious streak, which only grew stronger as he witnessed Terra's unification during the Emperor's conquest. Upon reaching maturity, Uriah embarked on a journey across Terra, seeking out pockets of resistance, but even the most remote corners of the planet had already sworn loyalty to the Emperor. Finally, in the lands of Frank, he found the very rebellion he had been searching for. There, he joined forces with militia determined to overthrow the Emperor. However, in the Battle of Gador, this army was annihilated, and Olather was grievously injured. Uriah managed to escape, and while wandering through the hills, he suddenly had a vision, which he believed was sent to him by a god, and his wounds miraculously healed. After surviving, Alat tried to return to his family home, only to find it pillaged, and the bodies of his family slain by Scandian raiders. Taking a few mementos, he left and stumbled upon the Church of the Lightning Stone. At this moment, he had an epiphany. He had been spared in Gador so that he could repent for his actions and serve the god. Thus he turned to religion, ultimately becoming the last priest of the church and delivering popular sermons. The church had the dubious honor of being the last place of public worship to be destroyed by the Emperor's wars. Its destruction was witnessed personally by the Emperor who, disguised as a simple warrior named Revelation, engaged in a debate with Olather on the merits of religion and the virtues of the imperial truth. During the discussion, they drank the last remaining wine Uriah had kept as a keepsake and discussed the history of the priest's life. At the conclusion of the argument, the Emperor revealed to Uriah the truth that the vision of Olather had not been sent by a god but by the Emperor himself as a manifestation of his psychic power. Olather hesitated in his faith and contemplated joining the Imperium. However, when the Emperor ordered the burning of the church, Uriah chose a martyr's death in the flames. Thus, in the year 720 of the 30th millennium, the Unification Wars were finally ended. The Emperor then set out for Mars, where he met with the tech priests of the Mechanicum cult. In exchange for the use of the vast infrastructure of the ancient Mechanicum, support from the Titan legions, knights and legions of Skitarii necessary for the Great Crusade, the Emperor agreed to grant the Mechanicum full political autonomy on Mars and other Forge worlds, as well as exemption from the atheism required by the imperial truth. This agreement, known as the Treaty of Olympus, marked the true birth of the Imperium of Man and an eternal alliance between Terra and Mars. And just 59 years later, the Great Crusade began, with the first expeditionary fleets leaving the system, bearing hope for lost humanity. Some heretics and demagogues argue that the Imperium is no better than its enemies, that its leader is an all-powerful tyrant with absolute power and authority that sentences to death entire kingdoms and species, that in life Emperor was a merciless autocrat and in death became another god demanding everyday human sacrifice by the thousands, left warring states and a paranoid warmongering society waging war on the entire galaxy. However, his conquest was never about lust for power or personal gain. He never drowned himself in riches, women or comfort. He never became one of the laid-back, lazy conquerors that rests on his former glory, spending away its spoils on his hedonistic urges. The Emperor fought for humanity, for progress till the very end. He advanced technology, statecraft, and upholding order in Imperium. Of course, one can find numerous flaws in the empire he built, in the sons he raised. But is it humanly possible to achieve more? Is there even a way to control a galaxy-wide empire with trillions of inhabitants? How can a man, even heavily enhanced and extremely gifted, stand against combined might of the Chaos Gods, or protect his numerous subjects? To err is human, and no other living being of flesh and blood is capable to surpass the Emperor's achievements.